The radio crackled once, then went dead. A young police officer lay upside down inside the overturned car, his breathing shallow and broken, eyes wide and fixed. He raised a hand to signal for help, tapping weakly against the door, slower each time. Before anyone could reach him, a rescue dog was already inside the front cabin, pressed tight against the officer's chest, completely still, as sparks jumped closer with every breath. A veteran rushed in from behind and dropped to his knees beside the twisted frame. The dog stayed where it was, holding the trapped man's breathing together. No commands. No one pulled it back. Something wasn't right. No skid marks. No signs of another vehicle. The call that sent the officer here came from a line that was supposed to be shut down. The veteran leaned lower and swept his light toward the back, then froze. In the rear seat, a seatbelt was still locked around a small body. A child sat there, silent, overlooked, never mentioned. At that moment, the truth hit hard. This wasn't an accident. It was a setup that almost worked. And really, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. The sound came wrong. Not loud. Not urgent. Just a broken hiss slipping through the radio, the kind that made Max lift his head before Raymond even reached for it. The dog's ears snapped forward, his body stiffening as if the signal itself had teeth. Raymond froze mid-step, one hand already closing around the cracked plastic of the radio, breath held without thinking. Years of habit moved him before thought did. The silence that followed felt heavier than noise. The engine was running seconds later. Tires gripped wet asphalt as the truck surged forward, windshield wipers fighting rain that refused to stay out of the cab. Raymond didn't speak. He rarely did when something felt off. Max stood braced in the passenger seat. Large frame, steady, black and tan coat darkened by shadow, amber eyes fixed ahead. Every muscle in the dog's body leaned into the road, reading what Raymond could not yet see. They found the cruiser where the road should not have ended. Halfway down the ravine, upside down, metal twisted, headlights flickering weakly through rain and mist. Steam rose from somewhere unseen, mixing with the smell of fuel and damp earth. Raymond stopped the truck too far back, boots hitting the ground before the engine fully died. His movements were careful, measured, the way a man moves when he knows one wrong step will cost time he doesn't have. Max was already pulling toward the edge, nose low, tail rigid, tracking something sharp and human beneath the rain. Raymond followed, sliding down the slope, fingers digging into wet soil, his body remembering balance from places far from this road. The cruiser groaned softly, settling into the mud as if the ravine were still claiming it inch by inch. Raymond raised one hand without turning back, a silent command meant more for himself than the dog. A sound came from inside the wreck, thin, broken, barely there. "Help! Please!" Raymond found the shattered side window and leaned in, rain running down his sleeves. The driver was young, younger than he should have been to be pinned like this. Officer Hale, mid-20s. Pale skin slick with rain and blood, dark hair plastered to his forehead beneath a dented uniform cap. His legs were trapped under the collapsed dash, twisted metal biting where bone should have been. Fuel dripped steadily from somewhere above, each drop disappearing into the mud below. Raymond tried once, then again. He wedged his shoulder against the frame, grunted, pushed, felt the car shift just enough to tease hope before settling back into place. His jaw tightened. He adjusted his stance, tried a different angle, the old instinct to brute force a bad situation rising and failing all at once. The car did not move. The ravine answered with another low groan. Max moved without command. He crept forward, careful, paws finding purchase on slick metal, and pressed his head gently against Hale's chest. The dog's coat was thick, familiar, alive. Hale's shaking hand rose and tangled into it, fingers clumsy but determined. His breathing stuttered, then slowed, just enough to matter. Raymond watched the way Max adjusted his weight, spreading it evenly, anchoring himself where the man beneath him needed warmth and pressure. A flicker of light caught Raymond's eye, then another. A spark snapped beneath the hood, small but unmistakable. His chest tightened. He stepped back instinctively, rein suddenly too thin, the air too sharp. He looked at Max. The dog did not move. Instead, he lowered himself further, broad body stretched across Hale's chest, ears angled back but eyes steady. When Raymond called again, louder this time, Max turned his head once. There was no panic in the dog's gaze, no question, only a choice already made. Raymond climbed back up the slope, heart pounding not from exertion, but from the weight of leaving something behind. He reached the radio again, thumb pressing hard, too hard, until the plastic creaked. For a moment, there was nothing. Then the static shifted. A voice cut through, faint and distant, like it had traveled farther than it should have. "There's a child in the back seat." Raymond froze, the world narrowing to that single sentence. His breath caught halfway in. Below him, Max lifted his head and barked once, sharp and final, the sound he only made when hesitation was no longer an option. The rain kept falling. The cruiser kept groaning. And somewhere inside the wreck, time tightened its grip. The night had left a mark neither of them could name. Raymond moved without counting steps, hands already finding the shattered rear window as if the glass had been waiting for him. He struck once, then again, until the frame gave way and smoke poured out in a thick, sour breath that burned the back of his throat. The heat was wrong, too close, too eager, licking along the metal seams as if the car were deciding whether to let go. Max did not look back. He had wedged his body low and wide across Hale's chest, shoulders braced, weight carefully spread, shielding the young officer from debris that fell in small, impatient pieces. Inside the back seat, the child was folded into himself, a small shape swallowed by belts and shadow. A boy, maybe 6, hair plastered to his forehead, shoes too clean for where the car had landed. His chest rose in a shallow, stubborn rhythm, each breath a quiet refusal. Raymond reached in, arms steady, lifting him free with a gentleness that did not slow his urgency. He turned and passed the boy upward, hands meeting gloved hands at the ridge, where paramedics waited with stretched faces and eyes trained to measure hope. Rain thickened as if responding to the movement, turning the slope into something that slid instead of held. Mud shifted under boots and tires alike, the ground breathing and settling with low, treacherous sounds. Raymond dropped back down, knees hitting wet earth, eyes returning to Hale without hesitation. The young officer's color had drained further, lips pale, breath breaking into shorter spaces. The fuel continued to drip, patient and dangerous, each drop a quiet clock. Hale's gaze flickered, unfocused, then caught on Max. The dog adjusted again, pressing closer, his breathing heavier now, sides working with a slow insistence that matched the rise and fall beneath him. For a moment, Hale's pulse steadied under that weight, a fragile agreement between bodies. Raymond knelt beside them, one hand braced on the metal, the other hovering where it could help without disrupting what was holding. We'll hold on." The words did not travel far. They didn't need to. Max's ears shifted back, catching them, acknowledging something beyond sound. Raymond stayed where he was, letting the rain soak through his sleeves, letting the ache in his knees remind him that staying had a cost. Above them, voices moved with controlled urgency. A medic's jacket flashed reflective silver as equipment was shifted, as the boy was checked and secured. The child's face remained slack, eyes closed, lashes dark against skin still warm enough to feel like a promise. Raymond watched from below, tracking the way the stretcher tilted and steadied, the way hands moved with practiced care. Something about the boy's stillness felt deliberate, as if he were holding onto the world by a thin, invisible thread. A flashlight beam swept the wreck again, lingering too long on the dashboard before lifting away. Raymond noticed the details that did not belong. The angle of the damage, the way the front end had taken the impact, as if guided. The skid marks ended too cleanly. The guardrail was broken, but not torn. It looked placed, not fought. He said nothing. He had learned long ago that some truths arrived best without being invited. Max shifted suddenly, nose lifting, a low sound vibrating through his chest that never became a growl. His attention angled upslope, ears pricked toward something that was not the rain or the shouting. Raymond followed the line of that focus and saw it then, a faint set of footprints where there should have been none, pressed deep into the mud and already filling with water. They did not belong to rescuers. They did not belong to the wreck. The rain erased quickly. It always did. A paramedic descended partway, crouching carefully, eyes sharp despite the storm. She was tall, hair pulled tight under a helmet, jacket darkened to near black. Her gaze flicked to the fuel drip, then to Raymond, then to Max, taking in the arrangement with the efficiency of someone who knew when not to interfere. She moved back up without a word, her presence brief but anchoring, like a knot tied where things threatened to come loose. Raymond reached for the radio again, thumb hovering. The screen glowed faintly, wrong for a line that should have been dead. He did not press. He watched instead as the display flickered, a pulse beneath the plastic that mirrored the fragile rhythms below. Somewhere, a call had been made that should not have existed. Somewhere, a signal had traveled a path it wasn't supposed to know. The rain grew heavier, flattening sound and depth until the world narrowed to breath and touch. Mud slid under the cruiser's weight, the metal answering with a low protest. Raymond shifted his stance, bracing himself where he could slow what gravity wanted. He felt the familiar tug of an old habit, assessing angles, counting seconds, weighing losses, then let it pass. This was not a problem to solve. It was a moment to hold. Max's breathing grew harsher. He pressed closer to Hale again, shoulders tightening, the muscles along his back bunching with effort. For a second, just one, Hale's pulse steadied beneath that pressure, a fragile alignment that felt like mercy. Raymond saw it in the slight easing of Hale's jaw, the way his eyelids fluttered without opening. Above them, a voice carried down from the ambulance, thin but unmistakable. The boy had spoken, words pushed out between breaths, eyes still closed as if he were talking to the dark. The man who did it wore the same badge. The sentence fell into the rain and did not disappear. Raymond looked up toward the ridge, the meaning settling in pieces rather than all at once. He followed Max's line of sight again, past the responders, past the flashing lights that fractured into long, wet streaks. At the edge of the road, where the slope met the sky, a black SUV sat idling, its shape barely defined against the storm. A figure stood beside it, unmoving, posture relaxed in a way that did not belong to rescue or chance. The rain ran between them, relentless and quiet. Raymond held where he was, Max did not move. And the night, having already taken so much, waited to see what they would do next. By morning, the truth had edges. The wreck lay silent behind yellow tape, its violence reduced to reports and photographs, while the hospital room carried the quieter damage that could not be folded away. Hale lay still beneath thin sheets, his body present but altered, breath steady where his legs no longer answered him. Raymond sat close, never having left, his posture unchanged through the dark hours, as if movement itself might undo what little stability remained. Max had not shifted either, his body pressed along the side of the bed, a living boundary between what was broken and what still held. Dawn crept in through the blinds without ceremony, painting the room in pale lines that did nothing to soften it. Raymond watched the light touch Hale's face, and then retreat, as if unsure it belonged there. He felt the ache in his shoulders, the familiar stiffness that came from nights spent alert rather than asleep. Max's breathing stayed slow and even, a deliberate rhythm that seemed to anchor the room when everything else felt suspended. The sheriff arrived without hurry. Walt was a broad man with a careful way of standing, as though every step carried weight he could not afford to misplace. His hat remained in his hands, fingers worrying the brim, eyes lingering first on Hale, then on Max, before settling on Raymond. He did not speak right away. He rarely did when the words were likely to bruise. What he carried came through his posture before it reached his mouth. Internal affairs wanted answers. The boy's statement had shifted something that had been carefully balanced for too long. It pointed inward, not outward, toward a badge that should have meant protection. When Raymond looked up, the silence between them stretched thin, taut with expectation. Who? The name landed without force, but it struck deep all the same. Detective Parrish. The room absorbed the sound and held it there. Raymond did not move. His eyes lowered, not in surprise but in recognition, as if something long buried had finally reached the surface. Max lifted his head at once, ears angling forward, sensing the change in Raymond's breath before anything else. The dog's gaze stayed fixed on his handler, alert to a weight that had nothing to do with the present room. Memory returned the way it often did, without invitation, without order. There had been another place once, far from this quiet hospital, where heat pressed down instead of rain. A convoy moving too fast through a narrow stretch of road, civilians caught in the space between orders and reality. The sound that followed had not been loud at first. It had been sharp, precise, the kind that rewrote everything in a single moment. Raymond remembered the fire, the confusion, the way blame settled unevenly when the smoke cleared. He had stood where he was told to stand. He had taken what was given. Parrish had walked away. Raymond carried that night the way some men carry scars, deep, unseen, shaping every choice afterward. Max had come later, found in the aftermath of another failure, another mission that ended with too many questions and not enough names attached to them. The dog bore his own history in the pale line that traced his flank, a wound that had healed crooked but strong. Together, they had learned how to stay. Now the past had found them again. Evidence arrived quietly, passed from hand to hand without ceremony. The device that had crippled Hale was not improvised, not desperate. It was precise, military grade. a model Raymond recognized without needing to look twice. The same one that had torn through that convoy years ago. The same design that had been signed off under Parrish's oversight. The circle closed so neatly it felt intentional. Max shifted, rising to his feet with sudden purpose. His ears snapped upright, body angling toward the hallway as if pulled by something unseen. Raymond followed, standing slowly, joints protesting as he moved. The corridor outside the room carried the low hum of a hospital waking into routine, but beneath it ran something else, a tension that did not belong. They walked together, Raymond's steps measured, Max's pace deliberate. The dog's nose traced the air, following a thread that led past doors and nurses' stations, to a side alcove where a window looked down toward the parking lot. Max stopped there, breath quickening, gaze locking onto something below. His tail went still. Raymond leaned forward and saw it, a familiar vehicle, dark and clean against the early light, parked just far enough to suggest coincidence. The driver's door stood open. A figure moved within the frame, slow and unhurried, as if time itself bent around him. The posture was wrong for a man with nothing to hide. Too relaxed, too certain. Raymond felt the old anger stir, sharp but controlled. It surprised him with its clarity. He had spent years smoothing its edges, teaching himself to live around it rather than inside it. Seeing Parrish again did not ignite it so much as remind him of its shape. Max let out a low sound, not a growl, not a warning, but something between, an acknowledgement of recognition. The dog had not been there all those years ago, but he understood patterns. He understood the threat when it wore familiarity like a disguise. When Raymond turned back toward the room, the hallway felt narrower, the air thicker. He felt watched in a way that had nothing to do with cameras or glass. He reached Hale's bedside again, resting a hand briefly on the frame, grounding himself in something solid. Hale's face remained calm, his breathing steady, unaware of the storm gathering just beyond reach. The sound came suddenly, Max's bark, sharp and singular, cutting through the low murmur of the floor. Raymond turned as the figure filled the doorway, leaning against the frame as if invited. Parrish looked older than Raymond remembered, lines deepened by time and something else beneath it. His smile came too easily, practiced, the kind that suggested control rather than comfort. "We should talk, Ray." The words settled into the room like dust, impossible to ignore. Max stood between them, body squared, eyes unwavering. Raymond felt the weight of years pressed down in that moment. The choices made, the silences kept, the cost of staying when leaving might have been easier. He did not answer. He did not need to. Something had begun, and this time it would not fade quietly into the past. The man who had betrayed him still stood in the doorway. Parrish did not rush the moment. He carried a thin file folder under one arm, the edges worn soft, as if it had been opened too many times by hands that could never quite let it go. His face looked older up close, the skin pulled tight over something fragile beneath. Eyes too bright in a way Raymond recognized but did not want to name. The room felt smaller with him there, the air shifting as though it had learned to expect damage. Parrish did not speak at first. He stepped inside, slow, careful, and closed the door halfway behind him. The light above flickered once, then steadied, casting sharp lines across the bed where Hale lay unmoving. Max's body tightened at once, a low vibration building in his chest. Not anger, but warning. Raymond stayed where he was, weight balanced, breath controlled, the old instinct to read a room returning without effort. Parrish's guilt arrived before his confession. It sat in the way his shoulders curved inward, in how his fingers trembled when he finally opened the folder. The papers inside were dense with dates and signatures, the kind that looked harmless until you knew what they hid. Raymond watched without touching them, his mind already bracing for what would not be undone. Parrish was not running. That truth landed quietly, but it changed the shape of everything. His illness had hollowed him out faster than time ever could, leaving behind a man who knew exactly how little was left. The cancer was terminal. There would be no trial that mattered to him anymore, no sentence that could compete with what his own body had already decided. What he wanted now was not escape. It was control over the story, over the ending, over who would burn with him when the truth surfaced. The crash had never been about the road. It had been about erasing something inconvenient, something that could not be allowed to testify. Insurance made a clean language for dirty work, and the system had learned to speak it well. Hale had been collateral, placed where survival was never part of the plan. The realization tightened in Raymond's chest, not as shock, but as confirmation of what he had already feared. Lightning split the sky outside the window, white and sudden, followed by thunder that rolled low and long, shaking the glass. Rain lashed harder, driven sideways by wind that howled through unseen gaps in the building. The storm felt deliberate now, as if the night itself were closing ranks. Max shifted closer to Raymond, his flank brushing Raymond's knee, breath quickening but steady, eyes never leaving Parrish. Parrish reached the bed and placed a small flash drive on the blanket, the plastic clicking softly against the metal rail. It looked insignificant, easy to miss, yet it carried weight that bent the room around it. Everything was there. Transactions, approvals, names buried beneath titles. Enough to pull down men who believed themselves untouchable. Enough to make Raymond a problem the moment he decided not to look away. Outside, engines idled. Not patrol cars, no lights, no markings. Just the low, patient sound of machines waiting to be useful. Raymond felt it in the way the building seemed to hold its breath, in the subtle vibration under his boots. The storm masked other sounds, but not completely. Something was moving closer. Max stepped forward, placing himself squarely between Parrish and the door. His growl was quiet, controlled, a line drawn with no need to raise his voice. Raymond's hand hovered near Max's shoulder, not to restrain him, but to anchor himself. The bond between them tightened, familiar and unspoken. They had stood like this before, backs to worse walls than these. Parrish watched them with something like regret, though it was hard to tell how much of it was real. He had once believed himself necessary. He had once believed that survival justified the cost. Now he looked at Raymond as if seeing him clearly for the first time, and that clarity frightened him more than anger ever could. There was fear in Parrish's eyes, but it was not of death. It was to be remembered correctly. He offered Raymond an exit, a quiet one, a chance to step away before the machinery turned fully toward him. It was not generosity. It was the last illusion Parrish had left to give. Raymond did not answer right away. He looked at Hale, at the stillness below the sheets, at the way Max's ears flicked toward every sound outside the door. He thought of the night years ago when blame had been easier than truth, when staying had meant carrying something no one else wanted. He felt the weight of that choice settle again, familiar as his own pulse. He stayed. The lights cut out without warning. The room fell into darkness broken only by the intermittent white of lightning, shadows snapping into sharp relief and then dissolving again. Somewhere down the hall, Boots struck tile. Measured, deliberate, more than one pair. The sound traveled fast in the dark, each step closing distance. Raymond tightened his grip on the bedrail, grounding himself in metal and breath. Max leaned into him, a solid presence against the uncertainty ahead. Parrish did not move. Whatever decision he had made, it had already been spent. The night pressed closer, offering one last chance, or none at all. The night broke open all at once. Glass exploded inward, not in a clean crash, but in a scatter of sharp, panicked sounds that filled the room before the mind could follow. A shot rang out, close enough to feel rather than hear, tearing into the wall above Hale's bed and sending dust and fragments down like sudden snow. Max lunged before Raymond's hand ever reached his weapon, his body a dark arc through the chaos, instinct faster than intention. Raymond moved on reflex, hands gripping the wheelchair handles, pulling Hale free from the bed in one practiced motion. The wheels caught, then rolled, bumping hard over thresholds as smoke poured in low and fast, stinging the eyes and flattening the air. Max circled back immediately, not barking, not panicking, herding them through the narrow space with sharp turns of his body, guiding rather than driving. Somewhere beyond the ward, a child screamed, high, raw, unmistakably alive. The hallway stretched longer than it should have. Emergency lights flickered red and white, throwing the world into broken pieces that refused to stay still. Raymond kept one hand on Hale. The other braced against the wall, pushing forward through resistance that felt deliberate. The smoke thickened, swallowing sound, swallowing direction. For a moment, even the building seemed unsure of where it stood. Max vanished into the haze. Raymond felt the absence immediately, a sudden hollow where certainty had been. He turned his head just enough to search, heart pounding against ribs that knew this feeling too well. Then he heard it. Not a bark, but movement, fast and purposeful, cutting through the confusion. Max emerged again, soot darkening his muzzle, eyes locked onto something small and shaking near the stairwell. The boy had fallen where the hallway narrowed, curled in on himself, arms locked tight around his head, as if he could disappear by force of will. Max reached him and slowed, pressing his nose gently to the child's back, steady and insistent. He did not pull. He did not push. He stayed close, step for step, until the boy's breathing began to match the dog's rhythm and his feet moved again. Together, they reached the stairwell, where cooler air slipped in like a promise. Raymond watched just long enough to know they were safe, then turned back toward the sound of boots and shouted orders that did not belong to any badge he recognized. The men who came through the smoke wore uniforms, but nothing about them moved like law. Their eyes scanned too quickly, their weapons held too loosely, confidence borrowed rather than earned. Hired men, sent to finish what the crash had not. Everything aligned then, all the fragments clicking into place without ceremony. The false call, the clean skid marks, the waiting SUV. Parrish had not been protecting a secret so much as delaying its cost. Insurance had been the language, but money had never been the motive. Fear had. Fear of exposure. Fear of the past catching up. At last. Another shot cracked the air. Raymond barely registered it before Parrish appeared through the smoke, coughing hard, one hand pressed to his side, blood seeping through his fingers in dark, spreading stains. His gun shook as he raised it, not with weakness, but with urgency, the last of his strength focused into a single, decisive moment. He fired once. The man closest to Raymond went down without a sound. Parrish sank to his knees then the fight leaving him all at once, the weight of years collapsing inward. He looked older than ever in that instant, smaller, as if the truth had finally taken what it was owed. Raymond moved toward him, but Parrish shook his head, a subtle refusal, his breath coming shallow and uneven. "Tell them the truth. Both of us." The words barely made it past his lips. Then Parrish was still, his body folding forward as if relieved to finally let go. The sirens arrived late, but they arrived loud, cutting through the smoke and confusion with a sound that reclaimed the night inch by inch. Boots changed pace, voices sharpened, then softened. The building exhaled as order returned, tentative but real. Raymond stood where he was, hands trembling now that they were no longer needed, staring at the space Parrish had occupied. Max returned on an uneven gait, one hind leg favoring the ground, his coat streaked with ash and glass dust. His muzzle was blackened with soot, eyes rimmed red from smoke. But they were clear, searching. He crossed the distance without hesitation and pressed his head firmly against Raymond's chest, anchoring himself there as if to remind them both that this was still real, still happening, still survivable. Raymond wrapped an arm around him, fingers digging into familiar fur, grounding himself in warmth and breath. He felt the dog's heart racing, then slowing, the shared rhythm pulling him back from the edge of something he could not name. Around them, medics moved with careful efficiency. Hale was steadied. The boy was found and held, alive and shaking but whole. Later, when the noise had thinned and the truth had begun its slow, unavoidable spread, Raymond sat alone with the small flash drive Parrish had left behind. He expected files, names, transactions laid bare. Instead, he found letters, dozens of them, unsent, unopened, written years ago, then rewritten, then abandoned. Each one addressed to no one and everyone at once, apologies stacked on apologies, regret laid out in plain, clumsy words that did not know how to defend themselves. Parrish had not been building a shield. He had been trying, in the only way he knew, to be understood before the end. Raymond read until his eyes burned. The last letter was short. "Be careful." He read the final line aloud without meaning to, the words filling the quiet space around him with unexpected weight. "If I ever fall, promise me you'll stay." Max lifted his head at the sound of Raymond's voice, eyes meeting his with a depth that asked nothing and offered everything. Outside, dawn began to gather its light. Weeks later, the storm no longer answered when the wind called. The hospital corridors grew familiar in a gentler way, no longer marked by urgency but by routine. Hale began therapy in a quiet room filled with light, his movements slow and deliberate, each small motion earned rather than given. Max lay nearby whenever he could, head resting on his paws, eyes following effort instead of danger. Across town, the boy learned to trust his legs again, steps uncertain at first, then stronger, laughter returning in brief, surprised bursts that sounded like something rediscovered. The truth surfaced the way some truths do, without ceremony. There were no cameras, no speeches, no public reckoning that felt satisfying enough to match the cost. Files moved from one desk to another. Names were spoken carefully, then less so. What mattered most was not how loudly it ended, but that it did. The night loosened its hold, not all at once, but enough. Parrish was buried beneath an unmarked stone at the edge of a small field, the kind chosen when words feel inadequate and history cannot be corrected. Soldiers shared those stones when apologies arrived too late and intentions were heavier than outcomes. Raymond came alone. Max walked at his side, pace steady, neither leading nor following, just present in the way they had learned to be. The ground was soft with early spring, the earth dark and receptive after months of holding frost. Raymond knelt and placed a single letter on the grave, smoothing its edges as if that might keep it from blowing away. The paper was thin, worn from being unfolded and folded again, carrying more weight than it looked capable of holding. He stayed there longer than he expected, not waiting for an answer, just letting the quiet settle. "You were right," he said softly. "Sometimes staying is the bravest thing." The wind shifted then, lifting across the field and carrying the light scent of rain that had nothing left to prove. Clouds moved slowly overhead, no longer threatening, just passing through. Max sat close, tail brushing against Raymond's boot, warmth pressed steady against his leg. The dog's gaze rested on the horizon, calm and unwavering, fixed on the same distant line where the storm had once risen without warning. Raymond followed that line with his eyes. It looked different now, not because it had changed, but because he had. The weight he carried felt redistributed, spread between memory and acceptance rather than pressing down all at once. He thought of the nights he had stayed awake listening for sounds that never came, of choices made quietly when no one was watching. He realized, with a kind of peace that surprised him, that staying had never been about endurance alone. It had been about presence. They did not hurry away. There was no reason to. The world moved around them in small, ordinary ways, birds calling, grass bending, distant traffic muted by distance and wind. Nothing demanded their attention. Nothing needed to be fixed or solved. The silence was no longer a warning. It was an invitation. Max leaned closer, a simple gesture that needed no explanation. Raymond rested his hand on the dog's shoulder, fingers finding familiar contours beneath the fur. Together they breathed in time with the land as it softened into spring. Snowmelt fed the ground unseen, making room for what would come next. For a while neither moved. The world did not need more noise. It needed this: a man, a dog, and a silence that finally meant peace. When everything finally grows quiet, what remains is rarely the noise that came before it. What stays is something smaller and softer, something that doesn't demand attention. It settles gently into the space where urgency once lived. There is a kind of strength that never raises its voice. It shows up without being asked, and it stays when leaving would be easier. It listens, not because it has answers, but because someone needs to be heard. Over time, courage changes its shape. It stops looking like victory and begins to look like a presence, like hands that don't pull away, and a heart that keeps steady time for another, even when its own feels worn thin. Some stories don't end when the mission does. They linger quietly instead, becoming reminders rather than lessons. They tell us that loyalty doesn't need applause, that kindness can be stubborn, and that even after long, heavy nights, something gentle can still survive. If this story stayed with you, even briefly, then it may have already done its work. Not to explain or persuade, but simply to offer a moment of stillness. And if one day you find yourself needing that quiet again, another place to rest, another story told slowly and with care, you'll know where to return.